This time in Goss's Garage, we're joined by Lyndon Abell from Rommel Harley-Davidson in Annapolis, Maryland, and we are going to talk about the new Milwaukee 8 from Harley. Lyndon, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
All right, Harley doesn't develop a new engine every other year like car manufacturers do.
That is true.
All right, how long has it been since we've had a new one?
So the twin cam was originally introduced, and we're talking about the big twin for their most common models, the families of their touring lineup, the Dynas and the Softails. The twin cam was introduced in 1999, and while it has seen some improvements and updates and changes over the years, the twin cam motor has been around for 18 years, and this is not just an evolution of that motor. This is an all-new motor. And as you mentioned, they don't do it very often. They did it in 36 for the knucklehead, and 48 for the panhead, and 66 for the shovel head, and 84 for the Evo, and 99 for the twin cam. So this is on a short list of big twin motors that Harley-Davidson has produced over the years, and it's really cool to be, to have so many components on a literally brand new motor.
Okay. All right. Now, Milwaukee 8 refers to the cylinder heads.
Yes. So each cylinder head now has 4 valves instead of 2. And since it's a twin cylinder, it's obviously 8 valves. So the Milwaukee 8 plus, it's got a nice ring to it, right?
Yeah. Now here we have a conventional 2-valve.
Yeah, this is an older head, and you can see the 2 valves. Let's get rid of these rocker assemblies, rocker arms, and you can see the business end of the Milwaukee 8 motor. So the advantages of 4 valves, I think a lot of people are familiar with that. The most obvious of which is that you can have a greater utilization of the space, so you can have room for more intake, more exhaust with 4 valves than you can with 2, because there's a certain level of dead space. The other thing is that by having 2 valves and more volume of opening, you don't have to have as high a lift on the cam. So that provides a little less stress on the motor. It allowed them to go back to a single cam. You can still get, essentially, to put it in simple terms, instead of having to open the door all the way open to get as much air through, if you have 2 doors, they only have to open partly as far. And by not having as much lift on those valves, there's less stress on some other things. They can use lighter valve springs. There's some advantages.
Gotcha. All right. Now, so we have 4 valves. Of course, there's a change in the combustion chamber configuration and so on. But here we have
2 spark plugs. So the spark plug hole in a 2 valve is on one side of the combustion chamber. And I think while most people think of a combustion event as taking place instantaneously, that's really not the case. In fact, if it did, that would usually be a problem. You have a controlled burn. Those gases are squeezed into the combustion chamber, and if the spark plug lights from this side, that flame front travels across before you get full combustion and the expansion that creates the power that pushes the piston down. If they can light the spark plug from both sides, I believe you have 2 advantages. One is probably a more complete burn, so fewer emissions are coming out because more of them got lit on fire. But also, that additional burn creates additional power. And also, it happens more quickly, so you don't have to light the spark plug off as much before top dead center as you would otherwise have to.
Okay. All right. Now, in addition to that, there are a lot of other changes here.
I
from
see you literally
have a
the ground up.
release in there.
Yes, an automatic compression release is stock on these, and Harley has had those for a while. It's a pretty slick little operation, and it vents into the exhaust port, so there's no mess on the outside of the motor. But when the ignition is powered on, that little pop-up valve opens up and releases a little bit of compression so that when the starter is trying to get that piston up on the compression stroke, it doesn't just sort of run into that much resistance. And that gets the momentum of the motor moving and makes it easier to start. Starter motor lasts longer. When things are hot, you don't get that
Yes.
and then kick back. Right.
Been there, done that. All right, now, another thing that amazes me about this, and we'll go on in a minute more with the technical aspects of it, but the aesthetics of it.
Yeah, yeah.
The rocker boxes, good Lord.
They really did a nice job, and I mean, people that appreciate how difficult it is to do a casting and get things polished and smooth can really appreciate the job they did on these. But while the rocker box really follows the function, right? Form is following function here. If you look at these, where the rocker arms are, you can see, this is meant to really follow the lines of that rocker arm and the form of the motor. And in a way that they haven't done in the last couple of decades. I think the knucklehead was very much the form of that rocker assembly was following the function of what was inside it, and to a lesser degree the shovel head, where the pan and the evolution motor and the twin cams were largely just sort of covering up the operation. This is really sort of shows it off, and I think it's got a beautiful muscular look, which is hard to do, which is why most of the time they don't do it. You just make something that's sort of squared off and covers it up and then buff it up. But getting things to look this nice and this nicely buffed, it's very impressive casting. And certainly some people say that stuff doesn't matter, but I think part of the appeal of a Harley-Davidson has always been, how beautiful they are.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But the interesting part about all of this is that the aesthetics, it looks like a Harley.
Yeah, right, exactly. So it's all new from the ground up, and yet both the feel and the look of the motor are inescapably Harley-Davidson. I think there was some concern from a lot of people that you would lose that elemental feel, that heavy low-end torque feeling of a Harley-Davidson motor, but the way the Milwaukee 8 feels it does not feel like a high revving short stroke motor. It feels absolutely like a Harley Davidson, just more so, right? Just more torque and more power. And the look, as you said, it if anything, it looks sort of more elementally Harley than the past couple of generations. Really did a nice job all the way around.
But here we have something we haven't seen in quite a while.
Yeah, for years, ever since the knucklehead, Harley has used single cam for all 4 push rods, but with the twin cam motor, obviously as inferred by the name, they went to 2 different cams. And the goal was the push rods were starting to be at a fairly severe angle, too severe an angle for a higher lift cam. And in order to make a bigger motor, they were going to have to do bigger valves, but they could only get so big with a 2-valve head, and the lifts were getting higher. And in order to keep that from being a problem, they took the angle from this and did this with it, so that it wasn't trying to push itself out of the rocker arm. And it worked quite nicely. I think some of us didn't think that the right side of the motor looked as classically Harley as they did before with the single cam. And it was probably a little more expensive to produce as well. There was some more moving parts, so there may have been some noise and cost issues, but I think a lot of us are happy to see them go back to a single cam.
All right, now the next thing that we have is the balance shaft.
Yeah, so this is like the 4 valves, really a big deal. Harley has had counterbalance motors in the Softails since 2000, but they worked in a very different way, and this is a more compact design. So essentially what's happening as the pistons are going up in the cylinder bores, it's creating a vibration that's going this way, and at that same time this counterbalancer is spinning around and throwing that weight down to counteract it. So pretty simple. I'm sure you guys have seen this in cars for years, but it's relatively new to us, including the design of this gear. But at the end of the day, what they've created is a system that a counterbalancer that gets rid of about 75% of the vibration, and the motor continues to be rubber mounted in the touring lineup, which is the only model this is offered in so far. And so the rest of the vibration is taken up with the rubber mounts. But I think that this could be tuned as they desired. So a different size motor could use a different size balancer. If they wanted a chassis that was going to be solid mounted, they could take out more of the vibrations and so forth.
All right. So we've got all of this. All of this is new, yet the engine still looks Harley-ish, which I'm impressed with that part of it.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously what they were going for, and I think they nailed it.
But also the cooling of this new motor.
Yes. So great point. Probably the biggest customer complaint for the last 5 or 8 years has been the amount of heat, and Harley has taken a handful of smaller steps to try to minimize the heat. But essentially the heat was created because in order to be compliant with today's EPA requirements, they were running that motor leaner and leaner. And in order to be competitive with customers' desires, they were making that motor bigger and bigger. And those two things combined to generate a tremendous amount of heat. And they had put deflectors on them and things like that and changed the way the airflow was aimed at the motor to try to address it. But a new motor allowed them to start fresh and address it in a more aggressive way. So similar to the twin-cooled heads that were introduced with the Rushmore models in 2014, they still have twin-cooled models for the Milwaukee 8, and they work in essentially the exact same fashion. A separate reservoir of antifreeze coolant is circulated around the exhaust valve seats, which is obviously the hottest part of the head,
right,
and that cools down, that hottest part of the motor. But in the non-twin cooled models, they have essentially oil-cooled heads that work in a similar fashion. The oil pump is much larger, and
Speaking of which,
that's actually from a twin-cooled model, but you get the idea. And it pumps oil into the oil cooler, so that cools the oil as much as possible, and then it goes into a couple of pipes that direct the oil through the center of the two exhaust valve seats, back out, and then deposit it into the back of the oil pan, where it follows a zigzag pattern before it gets to the front of the oil pan where the oil pump pickup is. So you've got about 4 gallons per minute of oil flow going through those heads, which is a lot of oil, and probably a good reminder of things that you and I talk about, which is that oil is not just there to lubricate, it's also there to cool. Now, usually it's not used in such a specific manner to cool, but it's, it does the job. And the result is a much cooler running.
Interestingly, you look at a Harley motor and you think it's pretty basic. You get behind the scenes, and like you just mentioned with the zigzag pattern in the oil pan and stuff like that, there's a lot of technology inside one of these engines.
Yeah, and I think that they certainly have the technological expertise to do almost anything that they want, but they are constrained to a degree by tradition and a desire for aesthetic appeal that may guide them in a specific pattern. So that's one example of some increased technology. This is a breather assembly, and so in short, when these pistons are coming down in their cylinder bores, they're displacing a lot of air inside a relatively small compartment inside the motor cases, and that air has to go someplace. In the old days, there was just a pipe coming out of that and it vented to the atmosphere. EPA said, that's not good. So they devised a way to send it up through the pushrod tubes and into the head, but what happens is there's a lot of oil sloshing around in the cases, and so oil is going up there also. And any longtime Harley rider has probably experienced oil carryover, where you end up going, wow, what's oil pouring all over the side of my bike? It's usually not a lot of oil, but hot oil can make a mess with very little, very small amount. And so the challenge is, how do you displace that much volume of air, keep everything contained and recycled back into the intake system without, and properly separate out the oil? So they've attacked it in two ways on this latest motor, on the Milwaukee 8. One is by having another cavity that allows the small oil case, engine cases to feel larger. Or be larger. And the other is this little device. So we were unsure about this, and we cut it open to take a look at it. And inside, what you have, the oil, let's start over. The oil comes in here and drains out these little two holes here, and only air comes out here, which is directed in a passageway inside the head, back out some breather bolts into the air cleaner. The way it manages to separate that oil is it comes in here and has to go through this maze of little plastic channels, and at each one of those turns, it's sort of likely that the oil will collect and drip off, and gravity will allow it to drain down, and then the air goes through this mesh, which will further collect oil, and then through this umbrella valve, which further discourages the passage of oil, and then down into this snorkel that pumps it through that hole and out the breather bolts. So the engineers that I talked to at Harley said they abused the heck out of this motor, and I won't even tell you what they did to it. It was so abusive. And they only got oil carryover once, and it was in such an extreme situation, you would never let that happen to your motorcycle.
Yeah. All right, and last but not least, we have this little guy right here.
Yeah, I thought this was interesting. So this is a knock sensor, and used them for years on cars. I don't know how long, but a pretty long time. And the idea is that if you have detonation, this sensor detects it and can retard the timing so that you don't, have motor damage. The problem with using them on a Harley-Davidson in the past was that they're pretty noisy. There's a lot of mechanical noise, and people like me sort of appreciate that mechanical noise, but it makes it challenging to use a sensor that's looking for a specific kind of noise. And whether the sensor has gotten more sophisticated or the motor has gotten quieter, I presume a little bit of both. They can now use knock sensors and prevent detonation. As things got leaner, that was a greater and greater problem.
Interesting. All right, Milwaukee 8, what are they available in?
Just available in the touring line, but that's certainly Harley's most popular family. And while Harley does not consult with me on what their plans are for the future, I think we all expect to see them in other models starting next year.
Okay, and they are available now?
They are available now at Rommel Harley-Davidson in Annapolis, Maryland.
Okay.
And you can also take one for a test ride. I think, for me, test riding a Harley-Davidson decades ago was a life-changing experience for me. And if somebody hasn't ridden a Harley, they should do that. If they haven't ridden a motorcycle, we have learned to ride classes. And if they have a Harley, but they haven't ridden the new Milwaukee 8, I think you'd be very impressed.
Okay, Lyndon, I want to thank you. And how can people get in touch?
Give us a call at 410-263-3345. Go to our website at rommelhd.com, or just come on by the dealership at 30 Hudson Street in Annapolis, Maryland.
And if you have a question or a comment or just want more information, go to goss-garage.com.